The sex abuse crisis is going to offer the enemies of the church an opportunity to reopen old wounds in order to undermine further and to even bankrupt the Catholic Church. The case of Cardinal George Pell in Australia is offering just such an opportunity, and it is a cautionary tale for Catholics across the Western world, where the abuse crisis was rampant. What I am about to tell you isn't merely a matter of righting a past injustice, as the story is being framed and will likely be perceived by many. Rather, this is the playbook for the enemies of the church to destroy the church, at least financially. Today it is in Australia, but tomorrow it's coming to a parish or diocese or nation near you, and this is all the cause of the modernists. But first I wanted to thank my patrons for their support of this channel. If you want to join them in supporting my work, there are links in the description below, including links to Patreon and Subscribestar, which is actually now up and running again. Also, I wanted to repeat my call for submissions for the blog, returntotradition.org. There have been a few articles posted by viewers and supporters like you, so please feel free to submit an article for the blog if you want to use the email address in the description below. I can't pay for them at this stage of things, but I do want to help get more Catholic voices out there doing this kind of work for the church. Our story takes us back to Australia and the mess from the possibly unjust conviction of Cardinal George Pell. Pell had long been criticized for his past handling of abuse cases, which he often provided relatively low dollar settlement amounts out of court. In at least one case I'll mention in the coming article illustrates this just point, where a settlement of $34,100 Australian on average is given. To give non-Australians an idea of what that looks like, today $34,100 Australian dollars is the equivalent of a little more than $24,000 United States today. Compare that to the settlement given by the U.S. bishops to keep abuse victims from seeking reparations in court. That Australian amount is infinitesimally smaller. U.S. amounts often hit the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are various factors that go into the differences of out-of-court settlements, and I don't mean to convict Cardinal Pell here of past handling of the abuse cases in his archdiocese. Rather, I do suspect that this at least played a role in the persecution of Pell by the Australian authorities. The chief investigator of the case that led to the recent conviction had been investigating Pell for several years, as you'll recall from my earlier video on this subject, and many of the charges he brought against Pell earlier had been thrown out of court for lack of evidence. Context in this case is important, as well as perception. There is a perception among both the pagans in the secular world, as well as among many Catholics, that the Church has vast stores of wealth, and that it can and should be tapped into for all manner of things, be it reparations for sexual abuse, to somehow curing global poverty by selling the Vatican. And yeah, I saw that claim this past weekend. And other silly ideas that fundamentally misunderstands the nature of wealth and the difference between liquid assets and non-fungible property. The majority of the church property is not available in liquid assets and would have to be sold. This includes works of art, property, and that kind of thing. Often the enemies of the church cite lands owned by the church that have no religious purpose, typically property bequeathed to the church after the death of a layperson. But even that kind of property isn't necessarily fungible, and not all dioceses in all countries share the same levels of wealth. I'm not sure what Australian laws look like on the governing of transfers of wealth from individuals to religious organizations. Maybe one of the Aussies in the comments section can educate the rest of us on that topic if they so want to. My point is this: certainly Pell's handling of the past cases of abuse victims and the payment of reparations must be considered when understanding what I'm about to go over with you. On to the article in question, from an Australian media outlet called The Age. It was published shortly after the conviction of Cardinal Pell. Floodgates to open. Victims set to sue the church for tens of millions. Abuse victims who received compensation through disgraced Cardinal George Pell's Melbourne response could be entitled to tens of millions of dollars in additional payments from the church. The Andrews government faces mounting pressure to change laws to allow victims of clerical abuse to sue the Catholic Church after receiving modest ex gratia payments under Pell's controversial scheme. like the language use here, Pell's conviction on sexual abuse charges has fueled claims the Melbourne response was primarily concerned with protecting the church's reputation while also minimizing its legal and financial liability. Under the scheme, compensation payments were capped at $50,000, later raised to $75,000, but required victims to sign a deed of settlement that waived their right to take legal action against the Catholic Archdiocese of Melbourne. Some victims in other states have received hundredfold increases in payouts after judges set aside their deed of settlement with the church. Victorian Attorney General Jill Hennessy will decide if Victoria follows Western Australia and Queensland, where courts can set aside a deed of settlement if it is found to be unjust or unreasonable. A spokeswoman for Miss Hennessy confirmed the state government was considering ways to ensure abuse survivors were not disadvantaged because they had joined the Melbourne response. We are looking at a range of options to ensure the survivors of institutional child sex abuse are not left off worse as a result of their participation in institutional forums such as the Melbourne response, and will have more to say soon, she said. Several Melbourne law firms have been briefed by dozens of victims seeking to challenge the validity of church settlements on the basis that payments were manifestly inadequate for the long-term suffering inflicted by pedophile priests. Under the Melbourne response, more than 320 victims received an average payout of $36,100. Lawmakers will also argue that some previous deeds of release, which prevented survivors from taking legal action, should be scrapped when the church, concealing its knowledge of serial abusers, had not acted in good faith. The integrity of the Melbourne response is further diminished by the fact it was introduced by Pell in 1996. About the same time I'm going to insert the word here, allegedly sexually assaulted two 13-year-old choir boys. Right-side legal participant Michael Magazanik is acting on behalf of several clerical sex abuse victims who will challenge their settlements. Mr. Magazanik said the conviction of Pell would not change the legal framework, but could pressure the Victorian government to introduce legislative amendments to help victims. It's a scheme dreamt up by a convicted child abuser which allowed the church to shortchange and demean sex abuse. Under Pell's scheme, the church stripped abuse survivors of their legal rights, usually in return for a pittance, he said. I'm going to interject here again and remind my audience that virtually all legal analysts in Australia have said that his conviction has a good chance of being overturned. But we'll continue. Mr. Magazanik said the District Court of Western Australia had already set aside more than 30 deeds signed by the victims of the Christian Brothers Order. That paved the way for a $1 million settlement to 74-year-old victim Paul Bradshaw, who originally received a $10,000 settlement in the 1990s. He died of prostate cancer in October last year, just months after receiving the revised settlement. Some of those planning to launch civil action against the church are victims of notorious pedophiles, such as Brother Edward Dowlin, also a Christian brother. He was banished from St. Patrick's College in Ballarat in 1974 for abusing boys and went on to assault children at 4 other schools over 14 years. Several victims of pedophile priest Gerard Ridsdale are also mounting legal cases against the Ballarat Archdiocese over his appalling offending at St. Alipius Primary School for more than 2 decades. If you want to read that article for yourself, you can find it linked on the sources blog, returntotradition.org. That story was more than a little biased in its reporting, and again, note the total lack of mention of the likelihood that Pell might win on appeal. The media in Australia is just as biased as it is in America, by the looks of it. But you see the narrative being pushed. Change the laws to provide compensation to victims that had been part of the 2002 international blow-up involving very real, very evil child abuse cases, which I do not want to minimize. The concept of changing laws to enable new lawsuits and new prosecutions should concern anybody of any stripe, especially since this isn't limited to Australia. In the United States, in the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, similar legal changes are almost certain to occur. For example, in New Jersey, the state Senate is in the process of approving a bill that would greatly expand the statute of limitations on sexual abuse allegations. The lawmakers in New Jersey explicitly cited the Pennsylvania grand jury report in their reasoning. Also recall that New Jersey has already launched its own investigation into the church and clerical abuse. I'm betting it's a done deal in New Jersey. Quoting one senator in question, "To me, everything they do that is good is overshadowed by the things that they have allowed that are horrific." That was State Senator Nicholas Scutari, who responded to claims that expanding the statute of limitations for civil sexual abuse would harm charitable organizations. Think Catholic Charities and those sorts of organizations. He's not wrong in principle either. No level of charity makes that kind of crime okay. There had been past attempts to entirely eliminate the statute of limitations in New Jersey, but those had failed for a variety of reasons in the past. Now, until today's politically charged climate on sexual abuse, and amid growing anti-Catholic biases in the media and among our betters on the secular left, passages of laws like this around the country is to be expected, and don't be surprised if the United States Congress takes up similar legislation, should that RICO investigation we're all expecting actually starts. The thing is this, I actually don't know what the answer to this is. I certainly want the legitimate victims of sex abuse to get the justice that is due to them. I certainly want the church to take meaningful steps to address this crisis. I absolutely want the modernists to pay for what they've wrought in the church. And this abuse crisis is absolutely a manifestation of modernism. Those modernists were true believers in their revolution, at least some of them were, and those who honestly believed that what they were doing was the will of God brought into the church a plague of sexual permissiveness, along with the embracing of worldly, secular, social justice values that permitted otherwise unfit men to enter the seminary and the clerical state. But at the same time, when I see the same secular authorities who promote abortion, the medical execution of the elderly, and the acronym agenda, then demand justice from the church for her crimes, I can't help but be skeptical that their efforts are coming from honest motives. The enemies of the church are anti-Catholic. They are anti-Christ. Their methods I find reprehensible, and I can't help but not trust anything they're doing in this matter. That may sound flippant. That may sound evil to some, but in the end, the church is our mother. She is being held hostage by evil, corrupt heretics and shepherds who have failed to do their jobs. Should our mother be stripped of her property because of the crimes of those holding her hostage? Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, I honestly don't know the answer to this problem. Chalk it up to the diabolical disorientation that has entered the church. Thank you for listening and for your support. Pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the church, especially during this time of Lent. I'm Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.